car date.
I'm a guest here,
Doing what?
getting my things.
You're out here a while.
Just came down.
Is that a toolbox?
It's equipment.
You work maintenance?
No, I'm
You
not.
need to slow down and explain.
I'm late for rotation.
What rotation?
I'm on call for emergencies. I'm a doctor.
I am 10.
The hotel sat across from a regional medical center, the kind of place that saw a steady flow of traveling staff coming and going every week. It wasn't a luxury property, just functional, clean, and close enough to the hospital that people working long shifts could drag themselves across the street without thinking too hard about it. Most of the guests were nurses, techs, or doctors picking up extra work to cover staffing shortages. It was familiar territory for anyone in healthcare who had ever agreed to a temporary contract, where the routine was simple: sleep, work, sleep again, and repeat until it was time to fly home. The man stopped outside earlier that evening and been staying there for 2 nights already. He had checked in, dropped his bags in a room on the 4th floor, and headed to the hospital for an extended shift. There was nothing out of the ordinary in his behavior, at least not from the perspective of people accustomed to this environment. The lobby staff had checked him in, confirmed his ID, assigned a room, and watched him walk away with bags that clearly looked like professional gear. What changed wasn't him, but the circumstances around him. In the previous week, the hotel had dealt with a string of minor thefts in its parking lot. Nothing dramatic, no smashed windows or stolen vehicles, but enough missing items to trigger anxiety. A few guests reported that bags left in cars had been taken, and one employee swore she saw someone lurking near the back lot late at night. Police made a couple of patrol sweeps, but nothing came of it. The reports weren't high priority, and there wasn't much evidence to work from. Still, the pattern planted the idea that trouble could be nearby, even if most people forgot about it after a day. Hotels operate on caution the way hospitals operate on schedules. Everything runs smoother when small problems don't become big ones. So when an employee spotted a man moving between cars with bags in his hands, while looking around and occasionally pausing, it activated that leftover anxiety. He wasn't yelling, didn't look aggressive, and wasn't breaking anything. He just looked like someone who didn't want attention, which in the mind of the employee connected back to the earlier incidents. The call wasn't angry or emotional. It was quiet, practical, and vague. Security passed the information to local police as a possible suspicious subject, noting the previous reports. They didn't claim he was doing something criminal, only that the situation reminded them of earlier complaints. When officers arrived, they were already primed to interpret behaviors through that filter. The man opening his trunk multiple times, shifting bags around, and appearing frustrated matched the loose pattern they had been briefed on. The officers didn't know who he was, that he was working at the hospital, or that his exhaustion made him look distracted rather than evasive. Bias doesn't always look like hostility. Often it takes the shape of incomplete stories, filled in automatically by people trying to make sense of what they're seeing. The escalation didn't come from anyone yelling or pushing or grabbing. It came from assumptions made quickly, reinforced by recent experiences, and sealed by the presence of authority. It also came from a pattern the officers hadn't consciously acknowledged, that some people were questioned first and understood later. The officer's body language reflected confidence, as if the situation had already been categorized before a word was spoken. What the doctor expected was a short walk to his car. What the officers expected was someone either defensive or dishonest. Neither expectation matched reality, but both shaped the first seconds of conversation. By the time the possibility of an explanation emerged, the frame of suspicion had already solidified. And once that frame is set, it becomes difficult to dismantle, even when the truth is simple. He was a doctor who had spent most of his adult life learning how to stay calm in situations that made other people panic. Emergency medicine didn't reward intensity or ego. It rewarded problem-solving and endurance. He wasn't the loudest person in a room or the one who tried to impress anyone with medical jargon. He moved through work the same way he moved through daily life, steady, focused, and a little tired, because tired was part of the job. He came from a middle-class family that valued education but didn't have a long history of it. No one pushed him toward medicine. He pushed himself, partly out of curiosity and partly out of a simple desire to be useful. He wasn't driven by grand speeches or dramatic ambition. He just liked the structure of it. Learn, practice, help, repeat. His colleagues described him as reliable, someone who didn't chase recognition and didn't collapse under pressure. Before he began traveling for temporary contracts, he held a stable position in a city hospital. He still had friends there and sometimes joked that he left only because he grew allergic to office politics. The reality was less complicated. Contract work paid better and gave him the freedom to schedule breaks when he needed them. He used those breaks to visit family, read, or cook meals he rarely had time for during long rotations. People who worked with him remembered small details: the way he always made coffee before beginning a shift, the quiet smile he gave when someone else was stressed, the habit of writing quick notes so he wouldn't forget something important later. None of these traits were glamorous. They were normal, almost invisible, but they made him the type of doctor other staff trusted without thinking. Outside of work, his life didn't revolve around dramatic hobbies or unusual interests. He liked jogging, listening to podcasts, and spending time with his nieces and nephews when he could. He kept a simple apartment he barely lived in half the time, because assignments sent him all over the state. He didn't complain about the travel. He accepted it as part of the career he built. There were moments, though, when being on the road made him feel like a stranger everywhere he went. Not just in airports or hotels, but in professional spaces too. He was used to people assuming he was something other than what he was: a technician, a medical student, or someone shadowing the real doctor. It wasn't hostile, just thoughtless. Nurses sometimes greeted him with, "The attending will be here soon." Patients sometimes asked when the doctor would arrive, even as he stood beside them in scrubs, holding their chart. He didn't hold onto those moments tightly. They weren't life-changing. They were just small interruptions that made him adjust, clarify, and continue. But repetition wears people down, even when the events are minor. Over time, he learned not to take offense, but he also learned not to expect immediate recognition. He used a calm, patient tone because it worked better than frustration. He didn't believe every misunderstanding came from ill intent, just a lack of imagination about who fit certain roles. He had never been arrested or detained before. The closest thing was an airport security stop when he carried too many electronics while wearing scrubs. The officer had asked if he was some kind of tech guy, and he responded, "No, I'm a doctor," receiving a surprised nod in return. It wasn't meaningful enough to tell a story about, but it was another example of being filtered through someone else's assumptions. By the time he arrived at the hotel for this assignment, he treated travel like a familiar ritual. Check in, drop bags, sleep enough to function, return to work. He packed efficiently: laptop, stethoscope, a few sets of scrubs, and a small case with portable equipment. He didn't think of any of it as unusual, and he didn't expect anyone else to think so either. He wasn't looking for trouble or attention. He was trying to get through a demanding week with the same quiet persistence that had carried him through most of his career. He didn't think he stood out. And that was part of why he was so confused when people treated him like someone worth watching with suspicion, instead of someone worth trusting with responsibility. The incident began with something ordinary. He realized he had forgotten supplies in his trunk. Not medical equipment he needed immediately, but items that would make the morning easier: clean scrubs, a charger, and a notebook with quick reference notes he sometimes reviewed between patients. He planned to wake early, head to the hospital, and avoid the scramble that came from missing something small. It wasn't dramatic planning, just efficiency born from long practice. It was late when he stepped outside, later than most guests preferred to be in the parking lot, but not unusual for people working hospital shifts. The air was still, not quiet, because traffic along the main road kept a low, constant hum. A construction site 2 blocks away sent occasional metallic clanks echoing down the street. It was the kind of noise that didn't draw attention anymore. It blended into routine city nights. He walked to his car with a sense of urgency, not panic, just the rhythm of someone who didn't want to waste time. He clicked his key fob once, then again when the trunk didn't open on the first try. He balanced a bag against his hip, gripped his phone between two fingers and tried to pull the hatch upward with minimal coordination. It resisted, and he muttered to himself, more annoyed than concerned. Across the parking lot, an employee took notice. She wasn't looking for suspicious behavior. She was leaving after a long shift at the front desk. She had heard the complaints about missing bags over the last week, and she had watched the manager install a new sign about guest safety measures. When she saw someone moving between cars with bags in his hands and glancing around occasionally, her instinct wasn't fear, it was duty. The kind of reflex that formed when small problems become tasks to manage, even if no one wanted to deal with them. The doctor finally opened the trunk, placed one bag inside, pulled another out, and tucked his phone into his pocket. The motion was simple, but from a distance it looked like someone shifting items quickly, watching for others and trying not to be seen. He didn't realize anyone was watching. His attention was on logistics, what to take up now, what to leave, what to remember in the morning. Traffic noise masked the sound of the employee making a brief call to hotel security. She didn't describe a crime, only uncertainty. "There's someone moving between vehicles," she said. "It might be nothing, but we've had issues." Security relayed the report to police, mostly out of habit. The phrasing shifted slightly. Possible suspicious activity, not accusing, just cautious. When the officers arrived, the doctor was still sorting through his trunk. He didn't see them immediately. He was focused on his backpack zipper, fishing for keys that had slid to the bottom. His posture looked tense, not because he was hiding anything, but because exhaustion made small tasks feel bigger. His shoulders hunched forward, and he leaned into the car with enough irritation to make his movements seem abrupt. One officer approached, announcing presence with a neutral "hey." It wasn't aggressive, just professional. The doctor straightened, startled by the sudden voice. His automatic response was to reach into his pocket for his phone, the same pocket that held his room key. The gesture looked quick, and because he turned slightly away while doing it, the officer interpreted it as evasive. "Hold up, don't reach for anything," the officer said, not shouting, just firm. The doctor froze, confused. He turned back, eyebrows raised, not sure what the concern was. His tiredness made him slow to respond verbally, and the pause filled the space between them with tension neither intended. He tried to explain that he was staying at the hotel, but the first words came out clipped, more abrupt than clarifying. The officer heard tone before context and filed it under argumentative. A second officer walked up, glancing at the bags in the trunk. He didn't see scrubs or medical equipment. He saw luggage, electronics, and cables. His mind connected them to property rather than profession. The misunderstanding didn't explode. It settled in, slowly shaping assumptions in real time. No one yelled. No one threatened. But the shift in posture, the clipped questions, and the officer's hand resting casually near his belt signaled that suspicion had entered before explanation. For the doctor, it was a simple errand breaking up an exhausting night. For the officers, it was a familiar pattern repeating itself. A call about someone who didn't seem to belong, acting in ways that matched half-remembered reports. The moment that triggered everything wasn't dramatic, just a tired man reaching into his pocket at the wrong time, in a place where people were primed to notice. Small movements misread, created a story neither side recognized yet. The first minutes didn't feel explosive, just uncomfortable. The doctor stood beside his open trunk, trying to recall what he had been doing before he was interrupted, and the officers shifted into a rhythm that suggested procedure rather than conversation. One of them asked for identification, and he reached for his wallet, moving slower this time, aware of their attention. His tiredness translated into delayed responses, not confidence, and the pauses between his words gave everything an edge he didn't intend. He explained that he was a guest, that his room key was somewhere in his pocket, that he was just getting supplies. The officers didn't dispute the details outright, but their tone implied uncertainty, as if every sentence was a claim that needed verification. He offered his driver's license, which one officer took with a nod, then stepped back to run the information. It wasn't a threatening gesture, but it created distance, physically and socially. They were now two separate groups, the one investigating and the one being investigated. He stood awkwardly, trying to maintain composure, but the interruption collided with fatigue and created irritation he struggled to mask. He kept explaining things no one asked about, filling space with unnecessary clarifications which only made him seem defensive. He rubbed the back of his neck, glanced at his watch, and sighed quietly. To the officers, it looked like agitation. To him, it was just exhaustion. A hotel guest walking across the lot slowed their steps as they passed. They didn't stop or stare rudely, but they lingered long enough for the doctor to notice. He looked away, wishing the scene could shrink instead of expand, wishing he didn't feel like someone being evaluated. The guest walked inside, leaving behind the sense that his privacy had already eroded, even if no one recorded or shouted. The officer with the ID returned and began asking questions that sounded less like dialogue and more like testing a narrative. Why was he outside so late? Why did he have so many bags? Why did he seem rushed? Each answer was factual but brief, the kind of clipped sincerity that reads as incomplete to people searching for subtext. He said he had early shifts at the hospital. He said he was reorganizing so he didn't forget anything in the morning. He said he was tired and just wanted to go upstairs. The officers exchanged looks that weren't hostile but skeptical. Their posture softened, but their phrasing didn't. One asked if he could sit on the low curb near the car while they sorted things out. It wasn't framed as a command, but as something he should do to make this easier. The suggestion carried weight. He hesitated, then sat because he didn't want to escalate a situation that already felt unbalanced. Sitting made him feel smaller, physically and socially. His position shifted from equal participant to subject of inquiry. He sat upright, hands on his knees, watching his open trunk fill with cool night air. No one touched him, no one raised their voice, but the structure of the interaction changed anyway. He tried again to clarify that everything was a misunderstanding, that he was on staff at the hospital nearby. The officer nodded vaguely but continued with a different question instead of acknowledging the statement. The omission stung more than an insult would have. He felt unheard, not attacked. One officer mentioned, almost casually, that he matched a description from previous complaints. They didn't specify what the description was, or whether it related to clothing behavior or timing. The doctor asked what description, and the officer shrugged, saying only that people have been breaking into cars. The statement wasn't aggressive, but it was heavy. It implied risk without accusing him directly, anchoring suspicion to a vague past rather than present facts. For the first time, he felt something sharper than irritation, fear, small but intrusive. Not fear of violence, but fear of consequences, of being mistaken for someone who did something wrong and then being required to disprove it. He sat still, heart thudding hard enough to notice, even though his face stayed composed. Another hotel employee appeared briefly, watching from a distance, arms folded. Not hostile, not curious, just present. Their presence meant there were now two people nearby who had no context but could form opinions based on fragments. He felt exposed in a way that had little to do with safety and everything to do with dignity. He didn't want witnesses. He didn't want anyone to remember this as a story. The officers kept their voices even, but their questions circled back repeatedly, as if testing his answers for consistency. He tried to stay polite, but his responses grew shorter, and his tone grew flatter. They interpreted frustration as withholding. He interpreted their skepticism as judgment. No one intended humiliation, but it happened in small, accumulating moments, being asked to sit, being watched, being doubted. Not violently, not loudly, but thoroughly. He sat on the curb, hands still, mind racing through possible outcomes, aware that he didn't control what happened next. The shift in atmosphere didn't come with sirens or sudden movement. It arrived in small, sequential adjustments that were easy to overlook if someone wasn't paying attention. A supervisor car pulled into the parking lot, not because the officers called for backup, but because standard rotation placed a sergeant nearby, monitoring calls and checking in when minor incidents risked stretching longer than necessary. At nearly the same time, the hotel night manager stepped outside, alerted by staff who wanted confirmation that the situation was handled. The doctor was still seated on the curb, posture tense but composed. His trunk remained open, bags visible, half packed, half unpacked, looking more like someone reorganizing on a tight schedule than someone stealing property. He watched the newcomers with a mix of hope and apprehension, unsure whether fresh eyes would help or complicate things. The sergeant approached the officers first, asking quietly, "What have we got?" The response wasn't dramatic. Suspicious behavior, possible match to earlier reports, still verifying ID. The sergeant nodded, not critical, just assessing. His attention shifted to the doctor, who stood up without being prompted and offered a restrained greeting. The night manager, meanwhile, came closer and recognized the doctor immediately. She had checked him in 2 nights earlier, remembered the hospital badge, the polite small talk, the request for a quiet room. Her expression changed quickly, from neutral professionalism to mild alarm. She asked, "Is everything all right here?" Not to the doctor, but to the officers, because that was the hierarchy she was accustomed to in these situations. The doctor seized the moment to speak, but exhaustion made his explanation brief rather than persuasive. "I'm staying here. I work at the hospital. I'm getting my things." He sounded like someone repeating information for the 3rd or 4th time, which he was. His tone wasn't confrontational, but it wasn't warm either. The manager nodded rapidly, confirming, "Yes, he's a guest. He checked in Tuesday night. He's hospital staff." She said it as though clarity were obvious now, as if a label could change everything. The sergeant looked at the doctor more closely, noticing the hospital logo on his badge and the worn lanyard clipped to his bag. "Your medical staff?" he asked, not incredulous, just verifying. The doctor confirmed, adding that he had early rotation in the morning and needed to organize his things before sleeping. He didn't emphasize credentials. He didn't list accomplishments. He just stated facts. The sergeant glanced back at the initial officers, expression unreadable but noticeably sharper. "Did we verify that?" One officer answered. "We ran ID. We're waiting on confirmation." The sergeant nodded, though his raised eyebrows suggested he expected more thorough questioning before escalation. Not aggressive, just procedural disappointment. The sergeant apologized, but not with emotion, more like formality. "Sorry for the inconvenience. We had some reports recently." The doctor nodded automatically, the kind of polite response conditioned by years of professional decorum. It didn't soothe anything, it just smoothed over the moment. The officer who first spoke with him shifted uneasily, acknowledging aloud, "We didn't know you worked at the hospital." The doctor responded, "I tried to tell you," not angry, not bitter, just tired. The officer didn't argue, but he also didn't offer a personal apology. Instead, he looked away for a second, face pulled tight with discomfort. Real regret isn't always loud. Sometimes it's silent and poorly timed. The night manager stepped closer, voice gentler now, as if worried about potential fallout. "If you need anything, please let me know." The doctor thanked her, but the gratitude felt functional rather than warm. He didn't want accommodations. He wanted the evening to reset to what it had been before any of this happened. One of the officers closed his notebook, signaling the situation was resolved. Another handed back the driver's license, offering a brief, "You're free to go." The phrasing landed oddly. He hadn't attempted to go anywhere. He had been outside in his own space, doing his own work. Being told he could go made him feel like someone who had been held, however unofficially. He stood beside his car, heart still unsettled, watching the officers and sergeant walk away with a combination of relief and irritation. He didn't want to prolong the interaction, but he also didn't want to pretend the moment hadn't mattered. The simplest option was to let it end without making anyone revisit it. Before leaving, the sergeant paused, almost as an afterthought, and said, "We'll make sure this doesn't go further." It was intended as reassurance, but it also implied recognition that the situation had gone somewhere it shouldn't have. The officers drove off, leaving behind quiet and the soft hum of traffic. The doctor closed his trunk gently, gathered his belongings, and headed inside. His pace was slow, not measured, just drained of urgency. He didn't look angry. He didn't look shaken. He looked exhausted in a way that went beyond work. The truth had been straightforward, but it arrived late, after suspicion had already shaped perception. And once suspicion settles, even correction doesn't undo the experience. It only ends it. The next morning, the doctor went to work as planned. He didn't tell anyone at the hospital what happened, partly because he didn't want to relive it, and partly because it felt too minor in the moment to turn into a story. He checked charts, treated patients, and walked through fluorescent-lit hallways with the same practiced efficiency he always had. His colleagues saw nothing different in him. No one asked if something was wrong because there were no outward signs to trigger concern. The incident might have ended quietly if a hotel guest hadn't written a short post on a local community forum later that day. The post wasn't angry or sensational. It described the scene neutrally: a man being questioned by police, sitting by the curb, looking exhausted, and later being identified as a doctor. The commenter wondered aloud whether the situation could have been handled differently. It wasn't framed as outrage, just curiosity. In an era where small observations can turn into conversation starters, the post drew attention. Within hours, people shared it, adding their own interpretations. Some commented about over-policing. Some discussed racial bias. Others defended procedural caution. The doctor didn't know any of this at first. He was busy treating patients who arrived with problems bigger than anything he had dealt with the night before. The world outside his shift moved without his participation. By the second day, a local news outlet reached out to the hotel, asking for comment about an incident involving police and a medical worker. The hotel declined to comment, citing privacy. The police department initially responded with a generic statement: "We are reviewing the details of the interaction to ensure that procedures were followed." The phrasing didn't confirm wrongdoing, but it suggested internal attention, which invited further scrutiny. When the department reviewed body camera footage, what stood out wasn't force, aggression, or physical harm. What stood out was tone, a subtle skepticism running through the interaction, an assumption of guilt before inquiry. Administrators noticed the officer's suggestion that the doctor sit down, even though he wasn't detained. They noticed the absence of acknowledgement when the doctor mentioned working at the hospital. The video didn't depict a dramatic failure. It depicted small failures layered over each other. The officer involved was placed on temporary administrative leave, not as punishment, but as protocol during an investigation. The sergeant wrote a report noting procedural deficiencies and missed opportunities for de-escalation. The language was bureaucratic and restrained, designed to categorize rather than condemn. The department initiated refresher training on bias recognition and communication practices, the type of training that shows up regularly in municipal policy discussions, but rarely in headlines. The doctor hesitated before seeking legal counsel. He didn't want publicity. He didn't want interviews. He didn't want a story that would define him. But when the hotel manager called to apologize formally, her voice unsteady, she mentioned insurance, liability, and documentation. The language of institutions made neutrality impossible. He met with an attorney who approached the situation pragmatically. The lawyer didn't push for a lawsuit immediately. He asked the doctor what outcome he wanted. The doctor didn't know. He didn't want money or punishment or speeches. He wanted acknowledgement. He wanted someone to admit the situation didn't need to happen. The attorney nodded, saying acknowledgement often required paperwork to become official. Discussions with the city's legal counsel began quietly. There was no press release or televised press conference. It was a negotiation about reputation, precedent, and responsibility. The settlement wasn't massive, and it wasn't publicized widely. It was structured around policy review, professional retraining, and compensation for time and emotional distress, though the doctor thought the emotional component felt hard to quantify. Headlines appeared, but briefly and without dramatic flourish. Doctor misidentified in hotel parking lot, police conduct review. Some articles framed it as an example of systemic bias. Others framed it as a routine procedural correction. Social media did what social media always does: amplify, distort, forget, and move on. The doctor returned to his normal life without seeking interviews or attention. He didn't change jobs. He didn't campaign for reform. He didn't write op-eds. He continued treating patients, signing charts, and carrying equipment in quiet, unremarkable hours. Yet the experience left a mark, not a visible scar, but a subtle shift in perspective. When he walked into unfamiliar spaces afterward, he didn't assume neutrality. He moved with a little more caution, a little more awareness of how quickly perception shapes reality. He didn't replay the event constantly. He didn't resent the officers personally. But when someone asked him later whether he felt angry, he answered honestly, "Not angry, just tired. Tired of having to explain who I am before I explain what I'm doing." It wasn't a dramatic conclusion or a cathartic transformation. It was a quiet adjustment to the way he moved through the world. A reminder that even minor incidents, handled professionally and resolved quickly, can still change someone's sense of belonging in invisible ways. He didn't want attention. He wanted to work, to rest, and to trust that ordinary tasks wouldn't become complicated. And he knew now that this wasn't guaranteed. The story wasn't remarkable because of violence, injury, or explosive confrontation. It didn't fit the narratives that draw national attention or spark protests. It was small, quiet, and resolved without dramatic consequence. And that's exactly why it mattered. The incident revealed something subtle about how people move through shared spaces, how quickly assumptions fill gaps, and how everyday decision-making can shape someone's sense of safety or belonging. Bias, in these moments, isn't always visible. It doesn't always appear as hostility or explicit prejudice. It can emerge as uncertainty, suspicion, or the instinct to categorize someone before listening to them. People rarely think of bias as something mundane, but often it is. It shows up in brief exchanges, in the tone of a question, in the speed of an assumption. It shows up when someone determines who is credible, who is trustworthy, and who needs supervision without knowing anything about their story. Systems don't create bias out of nowhere. They reflect the people who operate within them. Policies and training shape behavior, but so do daily routines, accumulated experiences, and the pressure to respond quickly. Officers, clerks, managers, and employees make decisions with incomplete information, and when they do, shortcuts are tempting. A set of recent thefts becomes justification for heightened suspicion. A sleepy gesture becomes suspicious movement. A tired tone becomes defiance. None of that means individuals are villains or intentionally harmful. It means people are fallible, and fallibility becomes dangerous when combined with authority and assumptions. The officers involved in the incident didn't intend harm, and they didn't use force. But their interpretation of the situation created a problem before they understood the context. Once suspicion takes hold, context arrives too late. For the doctor, the experience wasn't catastrophic. It didn't derail his career or threaten his physical safety. But it altered his understanding of how quickly competence and credibility can become irrelevant when someone else sees risk instead of routine. Being misjudged didn't surprise him. He was familiar with that. What lingered was the realization that in certain environments, being misjudged carries consequences he no longer controlled. The policies that followed were well-intentioned. The department added training modules about communication, community interaction, and implicit bias. Supervisors emphasized clearer questioning, quicker verification, and better acknowledgement when someone offered reasonable explanations. These adjustments weren't revolutionary. They were incremental, administrative, and ordinary. But ordinary changes matter when they accumulate. The story circulated among hospital staff, police officers, hotel employees, and community forums. It didn't generate outrage so much as reflection. People debated what should have happened, what could have happened, and how easily any similar incident could unfold in other neighborhoods, parking lots, stores, or workplaces. Some sympathized with the doctor. Others defended the officers. Many acknowledged that intent doesn't erase impact. What stood out wasn't the public reaction, but the private conversations, the ones that took place in break rooms, at roll calls, or over dinner tables. People asked themselves whether they had ever assumed something about someone based on incomplete data. They asked whether exhaustion or stress made them jump to conclusions. They asked whether they had ever dismissed someone's credibility before hearing their story. The answers weren't dramatic. They were human, flawed, and honest. Bias doesn't need hatred to function. It doesn't need malice. It can exist in the gaps where certainty is missing and assumptions feel efficient. It can exist in policies that prioritize control over conversation. It can exist in neighborhoods where unfamiliar faces are treated as anomalies. It can exist in the way authority is exercised, even calmly, even politely. The story didn't resolve injustice on a large scale. It didn't reinvent institutions, but it showed that harm doesn't have to be loud to be real. It showed that systems don't need to break visibly to create friction. And it showed that small misunderstandings, if unattended, can shape how people move through spaces they should feel safe in. The doctor didn't ask to be a symbol, and he didn't become a national headline. But his experience became a quiet reminder that fairness requires attention, not just policy. Listening matters before categorizing. Verification matters before suspicion. And humanity matters in every interaction, even when routines make it easy to forget. The lesson wasn't dramatic or poetic. It was simple. Small assumptions create real consequences, especially when power flows only one direction. Recognizing that doesn't require anger. It requires awareness and willingness to question habits that feel normal until someone else pays the cost. As this story closes, it leaves behind more than a timeline of events. It leaves questions about how people interact with one another, especially when uncertainty is present. What happened in that parking lot could have unfolded differently if anyone involved had paused long enough to consider context before conclusion. The situation didn't escalate into something violent or memorable in a dramatic sense, but it still changed the way someone moved through the world. That change matters, even if it doesn't make headlines. For viewers, there is value in reflecting on experiences that aren't remarkable for their scale, but for their familiarity. Most people have been misunderstood at some point, cut off mid-sentence, doubted, or categorized before they had the chance to explain themselves. Most people know the feeling of trying to clarify something simple and realizing no one is listening. These moments rarely become stories people share publicly, because they are too ordinary to feel dramatic, but they still shape how we carry ourselves. If you've ever been in a situation where someone assumed something about you before hearing your side, you may see parts of yourself in this story. Maybe it happened at work, in a store, in school, or during a routine encounter that should have been forgettable but stuck with you longer than expected. The impact might not have been life-changing, but it was real, and you remember it because of how it made you feel, seen incorrectly, judged prematurely, or treated like a problem before being treated like a person. This documentary tries to explore that space without exaggeration or theatrics. It doesn't offer a villain to condemn or a hero to celebrate. It examines an interaction that was procedural on the surface but meaningful beneath it. It invites viewers to think about how authority, assumption, and uncertainty can combine in ways that inconvenience one person while making another feel justified in their suspicion. If this story resonated with you, it may be because you've experienced something similar, not necessarily involving police or institutions, but involving people who made decisions about you without giving you a chance to define yourself first. If you're willing, consider sharing your own experience in the comments. It doesn't need to be dramatic or emotional. It can be simple. It can be brief. It can be something that happened years ago but never fully left your mind. These conversations don't just serve as catharsis. They help others understand how common these interactions are. They help show that misunderstandings don't always trace back to hatred or hostility. Sometimes they trace back to exhaustion, distraction, or routine. Recognizing that doesn't solve the problem, but it does help us approach each other with a little more patience. If you have thoughts about this story, or about similar situations you've witnessed, share them below. What do you think could help prevent misunderstandings like this from happening? What could people do differently when they feel suspicion or confusion towards someone else? How can policies encourage better communication before assumption? There are no easy answers, but discussion helps us think about the issue more clearly. If you want to see more stories like this, grounded in real experiences and handled with a calm, investigative approach, consider subscribing or following. It doesn't cost anything, and it helps support the production of content that focuses on everyday realities rather than sensational moments. We aim to explore stories that don't always get attention but still reveal something human, something worth learning from. Thank you for taking the time to watch, listen, or read. Your perspective matters not because it solves problems instantly, but because it contributes to understanding. And understanding, in its simplest form, is the foundation of change, slow, imperfect, but real. So before you go, consider the question this story leaves behind. How often do we assume before we ask? And what might shift if we chose to ask first?